Hey there, welcome to Synth Seeker. So, video today is going to be more on Berlin School. This is where I'm going to talk about trying to put it all together, talk about some of the pieces, what I call musical shapes that you want to start building, and then these are small pieces, and then you take those pieces and you compose them up together into more complex pieces. So what we're going to cover today is basically musical shapes, what some of them are, how to make them. I'm going to cover this set here that I'm working in Ableton, but some of this is driven from hardware, some is driven from software. So we'll just sort of disassemble some of the sounds. This is a repetition of an earlier video. I'm not going to cover it in quite so much detail, but we'll just touch on those. We'll talk about the shapes that are being made, what's in the clips, what sort of MIDI is happening, how are we building these patterns. And then we'll talk about what you can do to sort of take these ideas and run with them. So let's get started. So from a sound design perspective, we've got a few instruments here. Okay, we've got this analog pluck. I did a video on this earlier. It's just a basic analog pluck. You can make lots of variations on it. But what makes the pluck really is that it's relatively short. I've got a little chorus on it, but you can do whatever sort of timbre shifting you want to do. I've got a basic delay on it that's delaying at 3/16 notes, or a dotted eighth is what that is. It's got a lot of feedback, about half wet and dry. The echoes are filtered so that we're pulling out the lows and highs, so they sort of echo and fade out into the distance. And then I've got a big old reverb on top of it. A long delay and a nice long reverb tail go a long way to making that sort of spacey Berlin School feel. So that's a theme you'll see repeating over and over again. So that's our analog pluck. We've also got another variant on the pluck. Same basic idea. We've got a delay, copious reverb, and it's basically a pluck with a slightly different timbre. All right, as opposed to our first one's a little more hollow. The second one's a little more brassy. Additionally, we have here a lead sound. Again, delay and reverb, long tail. You can use like a Valhalla Supermassive or a Native Instruments RAM, something like that. They're very popular. Ableton 11 has a really nice hybrid reverb that covers those bases as well. Or just use your stock stuff. Guitar pedals, if you're using external gear, you can reverbs. These big cathedral spacey reverbs are really popular right now, so I'm sure you can find one. But that's just a sustained brass horn, sawtooth wave, with a filter applied to it, low pass filter that's slowly sort of breathing with an LFO. Again, we covered that, how to build one of those in the previous video. Then, as a nod to sort of synth wavy stuff, since a lot of Berlin schools came out of the 70s and 80s, these are just octave brass sawtooths. Really, a little vibrato in there, but no delay, and just a touch of reverb. JP, Roland JP kind of setting. Then I've got a sample playback I've got a bass guitar. Specifically, that's a Rickenbacker, because I really like prog rock, and I like space sort of prog rock from the 70s, which used a lot of this particular bass tone. If you're making completely electronic music, you may not have a sampled acoustic instrument, or even, an analog instrument that isn't electronic, if you know what I mean. Strings, horns, things you got to clean your own spit out of and oil off of. And I think in my style of the music I make uses electric bass a lot. So I do this electronic layers and then put some bass in there. And then we've got a little rhythm part, right? Just for a heartbeat. And those are the basic sounds. And I've built them both. I've got hardware stuff and I've got software stuff. And you can use whatever you like. You know, desktop units, big synths, you've got a big rack of Euro rack stuff, that's fine. Make sure it's in tune. Got a video on that as well, and go nuts. But these are the basic sounds. Can you do Berlin School with more complex sounds? Could you use a wave sequencer or wave shaping and all the new hotness? Can you do it with FM? Of course you can, right? It's up to you. What really makes the Berlin School sort of the Berlin School is repeating figures, some reverb and some delay. That's my particular recipe, right? Purists are people who are, if you go ask the guys from Tangerine Dream what it is, they might say that, or they may say something completely different. It's okay. This will work. And the whole point of this video is to give you some tools that you can use to get it going. Anyway, so that's the sounds. Now, Berlin School shapes, okay. What do we talk about when we mean musical shapes? First of all, you need to work in a key. Pick a scale, okay? There's a video in the corner linked on that, right? Do you have to stay within that scale? No. All musical rules can be broken. But if you're just getting started, pick a scale, and when you're selecting notes to play or to put in your MIDI clips or whatever, or you're going to sequence, stay within the scale. Scale's a list of 7 notes. Repeating across the keyboard, use just those notes. That'll carry you really far as giving your music a cohesive mood, okay? Now, you can add tension by sliding outside that scale a little bit, right? And so that's another video as far as tension is concerned, but check that out as well. Now, assuming you're working in a key and a scale, you want to make some repeating figures. Well, here's some repeating figures. Let's look at these clips. Here's one of the simplest repeating figures. It's 3 notes, C, G, C, right? And if we disassemble this, let me turn off the delay, and we'll turn off the reverb. And we play this clip. All right, it's just a little sort of hollow pluck. And when we turn our delay on, right, that gives us a texture or a bed. Some people call it a wash. And it's really just these 3 notes playing over and over and over again. All right. That's a repeating figure. You're going to build your music up by making repeating figures. You start with that one, then you make variations on it, and then you make alternates, and you layer them on top of each other. So if we take this one, all right, and then we take this one, all right, this is again simple repeating figure. It's these 4 notes, and they happen to have them repeating twice in this clip, right? Right, C, A sharp, C, D sharp. Right, I am working in the key of C minor, okay? And that's what these are all pulled from. And if we layer these 2 clips on top of each other, and we look at them layered, a little confusing with it moving because they're 2 different lengths, but we'll get to that in a minute. What we're seeing here is our orange clip, right, is playing. Hang on one second. Our orange clip is playing, right, these notes. Now our blue clip is playing these notes. Right? These are also in the C minor scale. So if you combine those 2 clips, what we're actually playing note-wise is right, those notes. And now rhythmically, the first clip here is actually quite short. It's not even a bar, right? It's just 1.5 actual, it's 1.5 beats. It's 3/8 notes, right? Just repeating. While our second one is 1 full bar. And what happens is when you play those on top of each other, you get what we saw when the clip was animated. You see, because the orange clip is shorter than the other one and starts repeating at its own cadence, even though they start at the same time, when the orange one finishes and loops around to the beginning, right, it falls on the it loops on the 4th 16th note of the overall bar, and then continues along, while the blue clip continues to play out, right? What you get is something that's more than the sum of the two clips. Because one clip is shorter than the other, and it's an odd meter, an odd length, what happens is, as it loops and comes around and starts again, its start point isn't always matching up with the start point of the blue clip. The orange clip start point is shifting over time, and it gives us a syncopated feel, and rhythmically our brain finds that very pleasing. So I started with this clip. Very simple. And then I made a variation of it. I duplicated that clip. Here are the original 3 notes. And I filled it out for the rest of the bar. So it sounds like this. Let's put a metronome behind it. Downbeat. Downbeat. Okay. So these two variations sound a little different. Downbeat. 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 So the first time it starts playing, it syncs up with the downbeat. Because it's an odd length, this on the second downbeat, when it restarts, it's off the downbeat. And we find that pleasing, right? So that's one variant. And then we've got this one where it always starts on the downbeat because it's exactly 1 bar long. And then I've got another variation here where this is 2 bars, and here's my pattern again, 3, 3, 3, 3. And then I've got these 4 notes that sort of add a little variation to it. All of these notes are still in key. Here's another variation. And here's our last variation. All right, so I've got these clips, and they're all very similar. They're all related. They started with this. Just 3 notes, and it'll repeat. Then we went to a full bar, still those 3 notes, but a little more variation there. They repeat with a little wiggle on the end here. Then again, our 3 notes repeating with a different variation. Now we've doubled the length of the clip to 2 bars. Here's another 2-bar clip with our note variation, but we've got some oddity here, and then another note here that we're adding. And then the final variation is 4 bars. And we've got our same basic pattern playing with a bit more variation. We're just building that up. So we have these variations on the pattern, and we can move through them. So it's really quite simple. You make these very small sort of musical shapes. You make these clips. And it doesn't have to be in software. Anything that you've got that can sequence, right? A hardware sequencer, software sequencer, it doesn't matter. Tape, tape loops. I found an entire channel dedicated to people who are actually doing sequencing and multi-tracking using multi-track tape machines, right? And tape loops. It's coming back into vogue. So you can do it with anything, but you start with small pieces. And then you build up over time. So we've got these variations, okay, for this sound. And then if we go over here, right, our sort of more JP style pluck, right? This was our original. It's in the key of C minor still. Then I started building some other variations. Now this clip has something really useful musically. Can you tell what it is? I'll give you a hint. It's not there. Yeah, it's holes, right? So while all the other clips had some note falling on every single eighth note, right? Just constant eighth notes with that ducka, ducka, ducka sort of feel, this clip has holes in it. So we've got eighth, eighth, right? Space, we've got a hole here. Eighth, eighth, space, there's a hole here. Eighth and a hole. Eighth, eighth, and a hole here. Eighth, eighth, and a hole here. And then the end. Right? You could hear those. And then this clip is actually 4 bars long, but we've only got notes in the first 2 bars. And we have this big hole at the end. So the absence of anything actually makes your ear sit up and take notice and go, oh, I was expecting to hear some notes in these gaps, but they're not there. And that sounds interesting to us. And then once this phrase, this is like having a conversation, this musical conversation occurs, and then there's breath. It's time for some other instrument to respond. Okay? So we can listen to that once more. And then this big 2-bar hole. And we're like, oh, really? What else do you have to say? It's a really useful technique. Here's another one. All right, so we've got that 2-bar hole there. This one's got a few more notes, but hole, hole, big hole, right? So leave some gaps. Let your music breathe a bit, okay? And then this last one is 4 bars long, but it's actually using half notes with a lot of big gaps for some, significantly different flavor. All right. So when we layer these, when we start playing these orange clips on top of these blue clips, right? Again, our blue patterns have these gaps in them, and we'll let them play. So, layers, right? So some of the musical shapes are small repeating figures. You stay within a key, right? These notes are all coming out of C minor. We're creating variations on these simple little pieces, and then we're layering them, right? Add some delay, add some reverb, boom, you've got Berlin School. Now, we've got this lead. So what you would want to do is if you're going to perform, let's say you're doing a streaming set or something like that, you would play in those gaps, right? In these holes. So if I start this going, So that's a way to have that musical conversation. Or you could just sequence the whole thing and have two different clips playing back and forth and talking to each other. That's a perfectly valid approach. I like to play, right? So it's up to you. Now, what else do we have here? So we've got this horn. You ever see any John Carpenter movies? This is right out of there. Right. So let's layer this on top of these. A lot of what makes Berlin School is the selection of timbres, the tones that you're going to use, right? We like these old school analog sounds, even though they sound kind of dry and boring. You know, they don't always sound exciting, but you know, layer them together and you get this beautiful texture. And then finally, I've just got a little 4-on-the-4 kick here, right? And so. So I don't necessarily, the point of the video isn't for me to perform, but you know, it's fun. You get sucked in. It's a lot of fun. So let's talk about shapes. So we've got these shapes, right? Clips, small repeating figures, okay? All in key, stay in key. And how do you create repeating figures? Well, what I've done here is the most basic one. I've got MIDI clips designed to loop. You can use audio to loop, right? Record your synths, record something from your synth, drop it in whatever software you're going to use, or a sampler or a looper, and set it looping, right? Repeated figures. But you could do it with clips in whatever your software is. If you have hardware sequencers, the sequencer is essentially a looper, right? You're looping sequences of notes. Arpeggiators is another way, right? So if you've got hardware software arpeggiators, like this one here, right? I'm just holding down the notes from the chord, or in this key. I picked 3 notes out of this key. And I've got a hardware arpeggiator basically cycling at 8th notes. I can tell it to hold, so I don't need to hold it down. And then when I go change the chord, I get a new repeating figure. And then you just change your chords whenever you feel like it. Right? If you've got friends you want to perform with, if you've got a synth and an arpeggiator and they've got a synth and an arpeggiator and you get them synced up, you guys could be making Berlin School together, live. And right, this is just the built-in arpeggiator in Ableton. There's just about everything. Every piece of software comes with an arpeggiator. It's hard to find a synth, a hardware synth these days, without an arpeggiator. If you're working in like Eurorack or semi-module or something like that, there are arpeggiator modules that you can get, sequencer modules as well, right? Another way you can get repeating figures is to use a delay as a looper. Okay, so here I've got a little stock Ableton delay, but you can do guitar pedals, effects pedals. There are dedicated looper pedals. There's a dedicated looper effect in Ableton. I'm not going to touch on it in this video, but you can use a delay. Here I've got a delay. This is that bass instrument. Okay, I've got a delay on that channel that's looping every 16th note, so every beat. Okay. And it's fading out slowly. And what it lets me do is set up a loop, right? So if I set my feedback close to 90, close to 100%, right? And this particular looper has the ability to freeze, in that it'll freeze what's in the buffer and keep going. It basically turns it into a near perfect loop. And you can use delays to make repeating figures of analog instruments, or physical instruments if you choose, right? This is or sampled instruments in this case. So let me start a simple pattern going. And I need a little metronome. All right, so here we go. There's a loop, and it's just the delay with feedback set almost to 100%. And it's going to slowly fade out. And if I want it to fade out faster, I turn the delay down, the feedback down. So it fades a bit more each time it comes around. If you want to get rid of it completely, you just let the feedback drop to nothing, let it cycle through, and now the buffer's empty. We can bring it back up. That's going. These are all techniques for getting those shapes, those repeating figures you want, right? So what have we got? You've got clips, any form of sequencing. You can arpeggiate, you can use delay for looping, you can use dedicated looper pedals, right? So you make these repeating figures. Then once you've got this collection of repeating figures, you just cycle through it, right? You can sequence your clips or sequence your sequencers, or if you're doing your performance, that's your job when you're performing. You're triggering a transition moving through different clips, right? So maybe we start out with these ones playing, and then I move and just start that one. And then I jump to this one. And then maybe I bring in a horn. Right? Sky's the limit. It's yours. So you take these small pieces, these shapes, these repeating figures, build them up, and then your performance or your composition becomes you orchestrating them. All right, some things you want to be aware of. So let's talk about some don'ts. We talked a bunch about do's. So do make repeating figures, do use a key, okay? Things to maybe avoid initially. You can always break these rules when you feel like it, but you may, if you're new and you're starting out and you want to achieve a particular sound in this Berlin school, you want to stay in key. So don't choose notes outside of your scale if you can avoid it. Maybe once or twice for adding a little tension, but don't do it a lot. It's just going to sound out of key. Okay, that may not be what you're going for. Once you have a bit more experience, you can choose to break those rules. Okay, so be in key. Secondly, every key, every scale has a root note. It's the first note of the scale. Think of that as home base, right? So in C minor, this C is our root. I'm playing a lot of C's here. I'm coming back. Regardless of what other notes in the scale I'm playing, I tend to touch on that C from time to time because it sort of keeps us grounded in the key. So stay in your key, focus on the root if you want. Think of a person, walking down the sidewalk and they're staying on C. They're staying on C, but maybe they meander off the path for a little while, but then they come back eventually. That's what you want to try exploring. Next, try to avoid randomness, right? You can get plugins or tools, or you can generate in your software or hardware random patterns that are truly random. They don't repeat. You can do that and certainly experiment with it, but you may find that having some repetition that isn't so random, like true repetition by definition, not random, gets the ear into the groove, right? So if I just noodle around with random notes, it may sound okay. It's in key, right? I'm not playing any notes out of key. And it may sound, experimental or science fiction, but it's not going to hook someone in and get them in a groove, right? And get them moving either mentally or physically. So think about repetition. Repetition validates, as it's been said many times. Next, let's talk about some more shapes. So phrasing, right? I talked about phrasing or the gaps, right? What makes this pattern interesting? Let me turn this stuff off. What makes that pattern interesting, I think, is the gaps in it. Instead of just playing 16th note after 16th note for the entire pattern, we've got 2 and a gap and 2 and a gap and 1 and a gap and 2 and a gap, 2 and a gap and 2, and then a big gap, right? It lets you breathe, right? Someone told me art is like breathing, in that you are going to, or creativity is like breathing. When you're making stuff, when you're making music, you're exhaling. But you have to stop exhaling and inhale sometimes, otherwise you die, right? You need the oxygen. Well, that's true of this phrase, right? We play and we breathe, and we play and we breathe, and then we have a big space for breathing at the end, where we think about what we're going to say next. Consider that, all right? Okay, let's talk about how different shapes overlay each other. Okay, so these patterns are all in the key of C minor. They all more or less work together. It is possible to make 2 patterns both in the same key that don't sound good together to our sort of Western ears, when you're used to, when you're making, popular music that is contemporary, and you're like, I want this to sound like this artist or this artist. And you're unfamiliar with, the notes in the scale. You know what's there, but you're not sure how to combine them. You need to listen, right? Because I can play, those 2 notes are in the scale, right? But because they're so close to each other, their interval is so small, they sound tense. Again, I'm going to link to the video on note tension, how to select notes and use scales. So you have to listen to your clips when you're layering these shapes on top of each other. If you've got one that's doing, and you've got one that's doing this, right? They're not going to necessarily sound pleasing when they're playing at the same time. Even though they're in the same key, okay? So you need to listen. Watch the other video. It talks about how to build chords. Speaking of which, let's talk about how our shapes, how our individual repeating figures, our patterns here, how they form chords, okay, or intervals. So we'll let these 2 play together. Okay, so we've got the orange notes from the orange pattern. We've got the blue notes from the blue pattern, right? Now, underneath, there's a blue one under there, right? They're playing the same note at the same time there, okay? So if you look at these notes in time and you look vertically, you're saying, oh, we're playing a C and a C. One pattern's playing and the other one's playing. Those work together. And if we look at this vertical, we've got a G and an A sharp. G, A sharp. Those work together, right? And then we've got 2 C's on top of each other. Those are going to work, right? And then here we've got, what's this, D sharp and a C. That works too. So you can think in terms of, when you're layering your patterns on top of each other, if you look at both of them at the same time, select both, or whatever tool you're using, look at the combined notes for those patterns, you can think of this is a chord. It's a unison chord, C and C, octave, right? But this is also a chord, right? This is also a chord. So you can think of these as little teeny chords, right? The first chord is this, right? And then the next chord is this. And the next chord is this, same. right? And the next chord is this, right? Right, and this is going. So it's. So you could think of those as little chords that you can measure and decide, does this add tension? Like if you've got chords that end up doing this a lot, right? And you can build your patterns or tweak your patterns, right? You can go just record a pattern and then record another pattern next to it, play them at the same time and listen to it and go, how does that sound to me? And then look at the notes. And if you see a lot of notes that are having these intervals between them that are dissonant, that are adding a lot of tension, you can go and edit those clips, edit the sequences, change some of those notes to be a selection of a note that's not so tense, not so dissonant. So anyway, that's a hole with no bottom. But the upshot is you want small repeating figures, you want to layer them, you want to put some holes in them so that there's space to breathe, okay? You want to avoid going outside the key a whole lot if you can. You want to avoid being purely random if you can. And then it's up to you to orchestrate all of these pieces, right? You're going to take all of your clips or your recordings and decide which ones are playing when do they change. If you've got a buddy you're working with or performing with, split up those duties and listen to each other as you're performing. And so when they make a change to a new pattern, you make a change to a complementary pattern, or, there can be some drama there where you guys are looking at each other and you've planned out, okay, we're going to have the big change here, and then we're going to have this sort of drop here, and then however you're building your composition. Ooh, this video is getting really long, so what I'm going to do is stop recording at this point, go and edit everything down, see if I can make this into a concise, not mess. And then in the next video, we'll talk about mechanical techniques. We'll talk about things like soundstage. How do I get that sort of spread, spacey wall of sound? Things like playable textures. If you're using a sampler or a synth that'll take a wavetable that you can feed user-made wavetables into, you can build sounds that are not classically tonal sounds. You can take sounds out of your environment, textures, and then pull tonality out of them and turn them into instruments. And it sounds fascinating and really works with this kind of music. We'll talk about how to do that. Really, that's about it. So I hope this was useful for you. If you have any questions or comments or things that you agree with or things you disagree with, put them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you make some music, post a link or say, hey, it's on my channel. Here's the name of my channel. I'd love to hear it. So as always, you have been watching Synth Seeker. Have a great day.